Welcome back, grade 7s. This is lesson 5.5, the First Nations and the War. In this lesson, we are going to learn what role did the First Nations play in the war between France and England. So, stick around and let's learn something. Lesson 5.5, it's the First Nations and the War. What role did First Nations play in the war between France and England? So, what do we already know? Well, we know a lot actually. This is chapter 5. We have a lot of background knowledge already in our history of Canada so far, and we've learned a lot. So, what do we know already? Well, when it comes to the First Nations and the war, here's what we know. First Nations were very deeply involved in the French and British War because the majority of our First Nations groups, they supported the French. They were allies with the French. But not all of them were. Some, like the Haudenosaunee, they did support the British, but the vast majority were on the French side. And when this war was taking place, nobody really knew, the First Nations included, they didn't really know that the winner is going to end up controlling all of North America. And that includes all the territories that are belonging to the First Nations. So the First Nations, they would continue to fight against the British even after the French surrendered. Because even though the French surrendered, there was still beef that was happening between the British and that of the First Nations. And the First Nations, they had very good reasons for anxiety. If you remember from the previous lesson, peace was made in 1763, and at that point, almost all of North America was given to the British. There was also no consideration for the First Nations. There was no mention of them at all, or little to no mention anyways. And during the negotiations and the surrender and the peace treaties that the French and English were making with each other, even though there was no mention and there was little involvement of the First Nations, the French still, because they were allies, asked the English to promise not to take revenge on the First Nations who sided with the French. But we know things aren't going to last like that. And no matter what the French asked for, they ended up losing this war. So the British are not going to be paying attention. The English end up taking over the fur trade, and they didn't follow in the customs that the French had established throughout the years of exchanging gifts with the First Nations. And that is very disrespectful to the First Nations. Not only that, not only did these customs not continue, the English also began to encroach on First Nation land. And again, that means, going into their areas, going into their territories. But we're introduced to an individual here. This is Pontiac. He's the leader of the Ottawa people. And he organizes an effort to fight a war against the British. And he went around and he spoke with a number of other First Nations along the Great Lakes area, and he convinced them to ally with them, so with Pontiac, and drive the British away from the Ohio Valley. And in 1763, Pontiac goes and he lays siege to the fort of Detroit, which is in present-day Detroit. Pontiac's allies, they are also involved in this, and they capture an additional 7 British forts. So these are 8 forts in total, and these are to the south and to the west of Lake Erie. And this is going to be a problem for the British because these Great Lakes are important to the fur trade because it allows them to access these goods a lot easier than going over land. Pontiac thought that the French would help because, well, why wouldn't they? The First Nations helped the French when they were at war with the British, but it's too late. There was no help coming from the French. They had already surrendered to the British. So the British, they end up responding. Reinforcements come, ships come over the course of some time. And Pontiac and his mission finally do fall because of just the physical strength that the British end up bringing to the war. But the First Nations did have tactics, and although the British had that physical strength, it was the tactics of the First Nations that led them to many, many victories. Short victories, yes, but victories nonetheless. And here's an example of one of those tactics that led to the fall of a British fort along the Great Lakes. So what they had done, what the leaders of the First Nations, of these two First Nations groups had done in this story, is they gathered outside one of the forts to play a game of lacrosse in honor of the king. We want to honor the king by having this game of lacrosse. Okay. This wasn't uncommon. This was done often. These games would play. And they decided they wanted to honor this king, the English king, outside of the fort. So the British soldiers, they're there. And over time, they start paying attention to this game, to this lacrosse game. They're actually pretty invested in it, and they want to see who's going to win. Well, this is all part of the plan, right? So this lacrosse game turns into this intense sporting competition. And it's all a ruse, it's all fake, and it's all done so that the British drop their guard. And that's exactly what they do. So what the First Nations who are playing lacrosse do is they're playing this game of lacrosse, pretending it's a real lacrosse match, and the ball accidentally gets thrown into the fort. Okay, by accident. And they go and they chase after this ball, and the British are just kind of standing there, because it's a game that's taking place. And on their way into the fort, the women that are watching this match, they give weapons to the First Nations, to the men that are running into the fort. And all of a sudden, this game of lacrosse turns out to be an all-out attack on this British fort, and the fort falls within a matter of minutes. It's a really quick fall of this fort. And this was just one way that the tactics of the First Nations helped bring down one of the British forts. And in total, 8 forts fell. And like I mentioned earlier, it didn't last long, but it was an effective strategy for the First Nations. And it brought the British, although the British came in and then they dealt with the situation with their reinforcements, it did cause and spark a conversation between the First Nations and the English. What I'd like you to do right now is head over to your notebook and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.